limited government perspective, and I am now very happy to be at the Goldwater Institute, which is the last refuge of principled right-wing thinking, where both libertarians and genuine conservatives can find a home. And we keep ourselves focused on the core issues that I think ultimately have to be the common ground for a limited government movement: property rights, free speech, economic liberty. Everything else is, in my mind, what I call fissile. If you try to fuse these things, they'll just explode on you. But these three areas are unifying and genuinely a basis for common ground. So thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's a good idea for government to combine legislative, executive, and judicial power in one elected body? No. Should societies allow their cities and towns to compete with private business to produce things that the market rejects? No. How about giving bureaucrats unlimited power over your personal lives? How about over your businesses?
Not even a little bit.
How about your property? You want to give them power over your property? Well, that's what we're letting our cities do right now. Our cities and our counties and our local governments have what is effectively absolute power over your lives, properties, and businesses. And I think it's about time that principles of limited government were applied to our local government. 350 years ago, John Locke wrote, and I think this is the best quote from John Locke I have ever read, quote, "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve freedom." He didn't exempt from that local ordinances. Now, 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "An elective despotism was not the government we fought for." And I doubt the founders would have fought for an elective local despotism either. Now, local governments are like any other government. If left to their own devices, the ambitions of politicians, the winds of public opinion, they will inevitably abuse their power and waste your money. In fact, America's cities, counties, and towns are already out of control. They are overly intrusive, and they are financially unsustainable. And we're finding that out every day, the more the economic figures come in. And that's why we now have to take our belief in limited government principles seriously. We have to put aside the mantra of local control and recognize that local government must earn our respect by securing liberty. And that means individual freedom and fiscal responsibility must be the bedrock principles of our counties, cities, and towns. We must demand what I've called a local liberty charter to restrain our local governments and protect our freedom from petty local tyranny. Just as our state constitution has the equivalent of a Bill of Rights, just as the United States Constitution has the original Bill of Rights, which were meant to protect us from state and federal government. This is the Local Liberty Charter. These are the 10 principles that capture, in my view, all the fundamental checks and balances and autonomy principles you need to restrain government to secure liberty. And if you're not convinced already, and I suspect many of you already are, let me introduce you to Darrell Brown. Now, Darrell Brown was my landscaper. I had no idea that he was anything other than the top-rated Angie's List landscaper in the Phoenix area. Not only that, but I had no idea that he had been going through a personal bankruptcy, a near total financial collapse at the time he was performing my contract. He's a man of his word under the worst of circumstances. And the way he got to the position where he was, in the midst of bankruptcy proceedings, having just gone through a foreclosure, was because Maricopa County in Arizona sat on his building permit application for 5 months. Now, that may sound bad enough, but what his building permit application was for was what's called a spec home. It was a tract house. He was getting into the business of small-time real estate development. And as a spec house, that means it was like a tract house. The county had approved this exact set of plans hundreds, if not thousands of times before. And yet it sat on his permit And during the first 4 months, it did nothing, and eventually returned it to him and said, oh, you know what, you've got a retaining wall here, you need to have a separate permit for the retaining wall. Turned it back to him and said, now it's time to apply for the retaining wall permit along with your building permit. He did, and a month and a half later, he finally got both of his permits. Well, this all happened just as the real estate bubble burst. Those 5 months spelled the difference between being able to build this house, sell it at the top of the market, and not. He invested $25,000 in interest payments. And when he tried to build it afterwards, he actually finished the house as the market was collapsing, because he's a man of his word. He didn't just borrow the money for the heck of it. He couldn't sell it. The bank took it back, threw him out of any sort of financial stability that he was in, and he had to file for personal bankruptcy at the same time without even me knowing. I had no idea he was such a professional guy that he was going through this when he was working on my lawn. Now, what happened to Daryl exactly? What was the violation that occurred? Well, I've taken the Liberty Charter and I've blown out of proportion the main rights that he was denied. Most importantly, he was denied a presumption of liberty. Now, what is the presumption of liberty? Limited governments, our governments, any government, used to be based on the idea that you should be free to act, subject only to the equal freedom of others to act, that you didn't need to presume that you had to have permission to do things that were otherwise peaceful, but that you could do them. And anyone who wanted to restrain peaceful activities would have the burden of demonstrating that that was justified. Our society, the whole notion of free and limited governments is based on the idea that you're presumed free to act peaceably. Anyone who tries to restrain that should have the burden of proof. His permitting process is premised on the exact opposite. He may do nothing with respect to the most basic plans that they've already approved hundreds, if not thousands of times. He must sit and wait until bureaucrats decide they want to move on it out of their own inertia and suffer. That's a violation of a basic freedom. The other thing he, of course, lost was his property rights. The right to use and enjoy your property peacefully without interfering with the like rights of others. That's why Daryl Brown lost his property. That's why he filed personal bankruptcy. He had his rights deprived from him. So the question is, what do we do about it? Very simple fix. 26 states already have, at least at statewide level, 4 agencies, statewide agencies. For some reason, local governments always evade this stuff because of the mantra of local control. You know, we just have this warm and fuzzy relationship with our counties and towns and cities that we're willing to defer to whatever happens there. But the truth is, 26 states have automatic approval processes. They have statutes that say if you do not act on this application within this period of time, it will be deemed approved. That one requirement, if it had been part of the Maricopa County ordinances or part of its charter, even with the equivalent of its constitution, I don't know, say 14 days to act on a spec home permit, or it's automatically approved. And he would have saved his property, he would have sold it, he would have saved himself from bankruptcy. That's what Daryl Brown needed. Not too hard to do. Let me introduce you to Kayla and Frank Pearson. Now, one of the myths about local government in its regulatory activities is that, well, they only impact property, and economic freedom, you know, the stuff that involves material things. Well, Kayla and Frank Pearson operate a bed and breakfast in Yavapai County in Arizona, which is in the northwestern area. Get closer. She was under a very strange system of licensure. If you wanted to call yourself a bed and breakfast, you could only have 3 units available for rental and rented at any one time. And that's understandable, I suppose, at least in theory. You can understand the English. But then it was coupled with this additional requirement. could only advertise, quote, seldom.